Hello CIS30A. In this video, I'm going to talk about lab for exercise 5. In exercise 5, you're required to write a program that contains a student class. You have 3 attributes to be added: name, ID, and gender. And we need to include member methods: register, add course, greet, and print course. And each student should have a list of courses. And then lastly, for D, give each student a unique attribute and courses. So when you test, you can use this data that's listed here to test, or you can have them input and you can check with the input value. So to start, we need to first declare our class. And in the requirement, it asks us to have our class as student. So the first line here allows us to declare a class called student, and we want the user to input in the value for the courses, the type of courses. They can type in a course like English or math or history, or computer information system. So we wanted to create an empty list named courses, and we wanted to use that list to store the user input. Then we would use an init method, and we wanted to make the attributes as instances for our class. So here what you're doing is you are laying out, right, the member variables, which is part of the class, and we're going to be able to use the object to access the data that's stored in these variables. So these instance variables that's going to be used. So for the init, in the parameter, we need to put self, and we wanted to print thank you for being a student at Moreno Valley College. And we wanted to have self.name, that's going to store the user name. So input what is your name, or enter your name. Self.id, that's going to be the ID number that the user enters. So we're going to go ahead and parse this into integers. So int input enter 4-digit ID. And self gender, and we wanted to have the user enter the gender. So we have input what is your gender. Now I commented this section out. This section can be used if you hard code in the data, but since we are having the user input, we are going to store that, and that's a little bit different. So I'm going to go through and explain on how to use the class and the instances to be able to provide the data as the user enter and for the object to be later accessed. So the first part, we simply set up our members, which are the variables that's going to store the data, which we want to be for attributes. And then the next, we're going to have the member methods. So since they are methods, we're going to need to start with def. And the methods that's required in the document, it tells us to have 4 methods: register, add course, greet, and print courses. So we need to have def register, and this is a method it's a member method, so we need to make sure that we put self. And I have a variable called num. This is gonna store the user input as integer, and it's gonna prompt the user to enter the number of classes that they want to register for between 1 through 5. So if a student wants to register for 2 classes, the person would enter 2. Next, we would call on the next method, which is add course. So it's going to go to the next method. Now, when we define the next method, add course, we are going to use self and num because that's going to allow us to implement the num as the range for the for loop. And in the add course method, we would have a for loop that is going to allow the user to enter each of the class. So if the user has entered 2 up here, it's going to loop twice, and each time it's going to ask the user to name the class that they want to add. So for the for loop, I have for I in range of num, and that all depends on the number of classes that they want to register for. And the course, we are gonna have the user input the class that they want to add each time, and we're gonna take the entry and we're gonna append it to course, which is earlier we saw that as a list. So here we need to do a self.courses.append course. So this course right here is simply each class that they want to register for, and each of those are going to go to a list of classes. So we would have self.courses, that's going to be the list of classes, and we're going to append each of the course that they enter as it loop through. Then next, we have another method called print course. And again, this is a member method, so we want to make sure that we put self, and we want to print you are enrolled in, and we're going to take each of the courses that was appended, we are going to print that out. So we would then need to use a for loop. Since courses is a list, we would have for I in self.courses, and we would print the class. Now, for the next one, we would have a method called greet, and greet is a member method, so we would have self in the parameter, and we would print hello self.name ID. So we are bringing down the information that the user had entered that was stored in the variable instances, the instance variable, and then we want to bring that down here. So name, ID, and gender. So we simply print that out to verify that that's what they entered. So after we complete setting up the class, the method for the class, we then would create objects. So first we would have the first object, which is student1, and we would create that as an object, and then we simply use that object to access the method, which is the first method is register, and then the next method, which is greet, and we use the dot operator there. So object.method. So student.greet, student.register, and student.printCourse. So that would take care of the actual first student. Then we would have a second object called student2, and we would create that object. So when we create that object, notice that this is the same name as your class name, and you simply add the parentheses there to create the object. Then we would use that object to call the method register, greet, and print course. And then next we would have student 3 as the third object, and we would use that third object to call on register, greet, and print course. So as you can see, you can have as many objects as you wish, but for our case, we are testing 3 students, so we can have student 1 as the first object, student 2 as the second object, and student 3 as the third object. So now we're going to go ahead and run the program. It says, thank you for being a student at Moreno Valley College. What is your name? I'm going to go ahead and enter my name. And we're going to have the 4-digit ID and the gender. And then how many classes do you want to register for? So I'm going to go ahead and put 2. And we are going to enter the class information now. So we can say English and history. So here it then now print out the information that I have entered. So right now it's doing the greet. So it says, hello Casey, this is the ID, this is the gender. I am enrolled in history class and English and in history class. Thank you for being a student at Moreno Valley College. And then it prompts me again for a second student. What is your name? So we can test a second student, John. And 2, 3, 4, 5. Male. And 3 classes. We are going to go ahead and add math, physics, and art. So here what we have is we now have the information for John, and John has ID information. So it's able to use the object to access the attributes, which now prints for the second student, which is John. And it's also using the member method when the member method is called, and it's actually displaying John information and John's classes. So as you can see, to wrap up the program, I initially has the class student. I have a list called courses. It's an empty list, as I would expect the user to enter the classes that they want to register for. And then next I have an init in which I state self, and this allows me to include the instance variable that will store the attributes so the object can later on access the data, such as name, ID, and gender. Then I have the member methods, register, and it is a member method, so I use self here within the parentheses. And I wanted to have a number of classes that the user wants to register for, so I would parse that as an integer because I wanted to use that value for the for loop, and I wanted to ask the user to enter the number of courses that they want to register for. Then I would call on the next method, and in the next method, which is add course, I would use self and num. So whatever the variable that you're using, you have to include that in the argument here. Then I would have a for loop for I in range, and I would pass over the num that I previously obtained in the register method, so that way it would loop up to that number. So if they want to register for 5 classes, it will loop 5 times. And then I would have the course to store each of the class that they want to that they enter to register, like English, math, physics, or etc. So here I would have an input method, and we would have the name of the class that you want to add. And as each time we would append that to the list of courses, and each of the class we're going to append it to the courses. Then after that happens, we would have the next method that's going to print out the course information, and we would print, and since it's from a list, we need to have a for loop, and we want to print out each class. Then next we have a greet method, which allows us to print out the student name, the ID, and the gender that they previously entered from above. Then we have to create objects. So we have the first object, student 1, and we can see that we instantiated the object there. Then we call on the method that we have defined. Then we have the second object, student 2, and we repeatedly call on the methods register, greet, and print course. And then lastly, we have the third object, student 3, and we again call on the methods. Now, if you are hard coding into the program where you don't have the user input, you have to pass the values as inside the parameters for these areas. So when you're using, and you can do that while you're creating the object and while you're calling on specific methods. So you can do it that way. And that's what those commented lines are for, if you wanted to hard code that in. And hard coding is good for testing. It doesn't have the user functionality very much, but you can use it to test to see how it's able to access the data. When the object is going to be able to access attributes, or how it's using the member methods when you're calling the methods. So this concludes my video for Lab 4 Exercise 5 in CIS30A.